Hi, Kathy.
Hi, Lia. Yeah, thanks for inviting me to join you. Yeah, and I'm excited to sort of share some recent work that I was doing throughout the lockdown in 2020.
So, could you tell us a little bit about it?
Yeah, sure. So last year in lockdown, I decided to start really exploring 16mm film practice. And so for quite a few years now, I've been a member of Bristol Experimental Expanded Film, which is an artist-run collective in Bristol. And there's quite a lot of skills in the members around this 16mm film practice. And lockdown felt like the perfect opportunity to sort of get involved in that. So I wanted to make a piece around the river near my house, and I was thinking about working really hyper locally with just the kind of sounds and materials and environments that were in my immediate vicinity. So I started exploring the River Frome, and I wanted to somehow create a 60mm film with the sediment and the kind of particles of the river to try and capture something of that, something in the sense of the river, but not sort of directly film it. And I kind of called it a collaboration with the river because I was quite interested in this idea that the process of collecting sort of bits of sediment and algae and plant matter from the river. And then I basically took it into the dark room, which was actually the back of my van. So there I was in the back of a transit van with these sort of jars of river sediment and some 60mm film. And I used the photogram technique where I kind of just placed the material onto the film. And this is where I feel like it was kind of like a collaboration, because the wetness of the material going directly onto the unexposed film already kind of starts some sort of chemical reactions happening and different sort of material responses between the different kind of stuff. And then exposing that to light and developing it. And I learned how to use this kind of eco processing recipe called caffeinol from filmmaker Vicky Smith, who's also part of Beef. So I was kind of excited about this idea of developing the film without using the kind of photography developer and using coffee, vitamin C, and washing soda. It's quite interesting editing with 16mm film because you just end up with this huge mass of actual physical film. And I've only ever done, non-linear editing on, computers where you just put your clips in a virtual bin and there they all are. You can get any bit at any time. Whereas with real film, you're sort of faced with just hanging up lots and lots of bits of film in front of light boxes and sort of developing a process. So this is a little bit that I exposed with some dirt from the river, some sediment from the river face. I don't know how easy that is to see. So yeah, where all it's kind of like shadows and traces of this sediment.
So, the clear bits is where the sediment was placed onto the unexposed film.
Because this is a negative black and white film,
Yeah.
I put the sediment on the film again, then I kind of switch on a light for like a couple of seconds and it exposes the bits of film where the sediment isn't covering it. And that goes black. So essentially it's a negative.
Yeah.
But I love the way that the sediment makes the light patches, and it's kind of like a light shadow. There's a
Yeah,
nice
it's
bit.
beautiful. And how was the audio created in this project?
Okay, well, it's a combination of things. Another thing that I'm really fascinated with is on 60mm film, the bit of the film on the edge opposite the sprockets is actually where the soundtrack would usually be printed. And I'm really fascinated by optical soundtracks. I learned earlier last year on a residency to Russia some very early experiments in sound synthesis, where this realization that the optical soundtrack of a film could actually be drawn or made. There's always kind of elaborate machines to kind of create these sound wave patterns and synthesize sound directly onto film as very, very early synthesizers in sort of the early 20th century. So I kind of really fascinated with that. But basically, because this is a photogram film and it's not using a camera, I can actually, some of the sediment and plant matter lands on this soundtrack. So wherever some of the sediment lands on the soundtrack, you get a sound from the 60mm projector. So I was really aware that this was going to make sound as well. And the other reason I was sort of seeing it as a kind of collaboration with the river was that I didn't have full control over how the sediment was going to land and which bits were going to go on the soundtrack. So there was sort of a really nice element of improvisation and discovery. So when I first played the film, it's the first time I heard the sounds and sort of saw the densities, and when they're kind of making it, I could get a sense of density. So I knew that by sort of putting like really globby bits of sediment, that it would be obviously quite noisy and quite light. And then, so I was kind of working a little bit with compositionally, but also quite, you have to be sort of fairly approximate and it's also really exciting because there's so many different things that might happen when you actually eventually see the film, and the way that the coffee and the vitamin C, the caffeinol develops, there's room for unexpected results sometimes, which is always interesting and welcome. Yeah, and just to say another thing about the sound on the film is that I mix between the optical soundtrack of the film and with hydrophone recordings from the same spot in the river. And what's really fascinating is so many of those underwater sounds sometimes can sound a bit electronic or also a bit like the optical soundtrack of the film. So I kind of like this sort of unknown, like, is it the optical soundtrack? Is it artificially created synthesized sound, or is it actually these unusual sounds from underwater? So it kind of mixes between those two kind of elements of content in the soundtrack. And one further development in the soundtrack is that I realized when I went to try and digitize the film, because I did want to also show it online, as you're I'm very happy that you're sort of going to show some of it today. You can scan the film, but you don't get the optical soundtrack on the scan. And when I perform live with it with the 60mm projector, I'm changing the speed of the film live to sort of speed it up and slow it down to change the kind of, just to sort of play live with it whilst mixing in these underwater sounds. And I was at a bit of a point where I was like, how can I document that effectively and digitize it? So I worked with a programmer called Matthew Olden, and he built me a max patch that I could run the scanned film through, change the frame rate, and also built a system to read the optical soundtrack, but kind of digitally. So it's slightly different to the way the projector reads it. So I've got this, and of course, once it's in a max patch and you can do those kinds of things, I could actually read the optical soundtrack at any point in the film. It didn't have to be on the one side. So I started playing with some more possibilities of working with the light and dark of the film and the speed of the film digitally. So I've also kind of played around with that and used the optical soundtrack to also filter it with an EQ. So it's become this quite evolving process of sound into visual, visual into sound, from analog to digital and back again. And so it's, yeah.
I'm curious how this process of working with serendipity and unexpected results and collaboration with an outside source might feed back into your future work. For example, if you're working more in sculpture or in musical instrument design, do you think that now you might open up your process to a bit more of a collaborative design element?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think actually this approach to the film grew from not necessarily some of the design elements of some sculptural instruments I've made. So for instance, I know that we met when I was showing Tipping Points in London a few years ago. And this piece, even though it's quite precisely designed and the electronics, the way that it works is quite precisely designed, the actual process of playing it, I can't really have absolute full control because it uses audio feedback. And the way that I control the sound is purely based on the flow of water, which is quite slow. So even when I move one of the tubes, I know it's going to change pitch, but I don't know how long that's necessarily going to take. And it's kind of like a collaboration or a sculptural way of working with the piece. And I think that's what I find really appealing about performing live with it, because I have to listen to what's happening at the same time as shifting and changing something. And then all of the kind of acoustic properties of the room come into play as well. So I think I really already enjoy creating instruments or processes where there's going to be some unknown quantities, or I use some kind of generative behavior. Like even when Tipping Point's running as an installation, it doesn't have a fixed sequence. It's got a set of parameters that have got probabilities of whether they're going to happen or not. So I like to sort of sit in it and wonder what it's going to do, and it presents different sequences that I probably wouldn't have thought of. So I kind of enjoy that process in all of the works that I'm kind of playing around with.
So how about we have a look at river traces? Thanks, Kathy, for joining us.
Thanks for having me.